The Reign of Terror had traumatized French society, leaving a death toll and legacy of political violence which seemed unprecedented in modern memory for most Europeans. The coup launched against Robespierre and Thermidor had sought to end the Jacobin dictatorship. The so-called Thermidorians, who now assumed power, faced a series of daunting tasks as they set to work. In the wake of the Terror, there was a need for a period of stability and reconciliation. France needed to be rehabilitated, a stable government had to be set up, and radical republicanism had to be curbed. In spite of the excesses of Robespierre and the Jacobins, the Thermidorians were republicans. Their views were moderate in comparison to the Jacobins, but they nonetheless had ambitions of re-establishing a functioning republic. Above all, they sought to place French government on a solid constitutional foundation and re-establish the rule of law in the country. In essence, Thermidorians were faced with the task of providing an alternative to the radical and revolutionary government of the Jacobins. They intended to lay the foundation for a post-terror republic that would uphold the ideals of 1789 while avoiding the radicalism and excesses of the 1790s. Justice is the order of the day, as the new government proclaimed. Yet what did justice imply? Immediately following the coup against the Robespierrists, the government took aim at the radicals. Former political enemies, like the Girondins, were permitted to hunt down former Jacobin officials and sans-culotte leaders, carrying out revenge killings. Jacobin clubs were purged, and members hauled before tribunals to answer for their crimes. The Jacobin terror apparatus was dismantled and replaced with a new security state that would impose and enforce justice against all those who threatened the stability of the Republic. Following this political purge, a new constitution was proclaimed in 1795, year 3 according to the revolutionary calendar. This intended to anchor the Republic in a new legal regime, which would place the state on a stable footing. The so-called Directory government established by the Thermidorians was based on moderate principles. The Constitution provided for a balance of power between the branches of government. This careful system of checks and balances was to ensure that no single person or faction could take control of the government, as the Jacobins had done. The Thermidorians were also conscious of how the Jacobins had used universal suffrage to support the drift toward dictatorship. They had rallied people with fiery speeches and nationalist appeals to gain broad support for their illiberal policies. Taking this experience to heart, moderates maintained a patent distrust of popular democracy. The masses could be easily swayed and manipulated, it was argued, and this led ultimately to tyranny. Under the new constitution, voting rights were scaled back to prevent against the demagoguery that had encouraged Robespierre's rise to power. The old idea of active citizenship was reinstated. Material and moral requirements were once again required to hold voting rights. Those with property and those who were educated were fit to lead society, moderates insisted. Although it was clearly a reaction to the radical democratic movements of the 1790s, this idea was not necessarily distinct from the logic of the Jacobins. While Enlightenment thinkers had stressed man's natural rights, Robespierre had emphasized the need for virtue in the true republican citizen. But virtue was a quality, not a condition. While all may possess natural rights, not everyone possessed virtue. And this idea of the virtuous citizen could easily be used to defend a system of restricted voting, one that favored property holders and educated elites to the exclusion of the general populace. These ideas broadly came to define the post-terror republic in France, a regime that was constitutional but hardly disposed toward mass democracy. And while this arrangement saw through the regime change desired by moderates, it did not mean that the Directory was popular with the general public. The Republic faced a dire economic crisis as the new government took charge. On top of this, France was still at war with the European powers. The wealth that the war brought in from conquered territories was needed by the government, and this entailed continuing the war efforts started by the radicals. The war cause appealed to the people's sense of patriotism, and the Directory hoped it could use this to bolster support for its shaky regime. To this end, the new government retained the territories occupied by the French army in Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries. These areas were transformed into sister republics, territories liberated by the French from absolutist rule. These so-called sister republics were organized around the principle of national self-determination. Government, Republicans argued, should reflect the collective will of the people. This meant that territories occupied by French forces would be given their own national governments and serve as allies to the French Republic in its struggle against absolutist monarchy. Over the next 5 years, this last objective was the only one that met with any real success. Unable to remedy the country's economic problems and unpopular with the general public, the Directory found itself in a constantly precarious situation as unemployment, scarcity, and growing inequalities in wealth persisted. It was in this atmosphere that the political organizer Gracchus Babeuf began making a name for himself. Jailed on various occasions in the past for his radical views, Babeuf presented himself as a champion of the oppressed and suffering working classes. He set up a secret society in which all members called themselves simply the Equals. He ran a newspaper entitled Tribune of the People. With mounting economic pressure on the French working classes, Babeuf drafted a new manifesto in 1795, entitling it The Conspiracy of the Equals. In this document, Babeuf called for the equal distribution of wealth and the abolition of private property. He denounced the new Directory in power, arguing that a constitutional regime did not guarantee true equality. True equality, in his view, meant social equality, and this meant empowering the workers and redistributing the wealth of the country. Songs carrying Babeuf's message were sung in the cafes where workers socialized, with lyrics like Mourant de faim, mourant de froid, dying of hunger, dying of cold. These became rallying cries for a new opposition of the lower classes. Only a year after Robespierre had been deposed, the specter of sans-culotte radicalism was already pestering the regime. This time, the government had no intention of letting the radicals get the upper hand. The Directory summarily rounded up Babeuf and his associates. They were tried for conspiracy against the government and executed, putting an end to the threat of another revolutionary reign of terror. Although suppressed, the resurgence of Jacobin-style radicalism was indicative of a larger problem. The French Revolution had given rise to various aspirations and expectations. It had animated society and created a restless energy that needed to be pacified. The question was, Could this revolutionary fervor exist within the confines of a stable society? This was by no means certain as the 1790s progressed, and faith in the Directory diminished. For some, these circumstances appeared ominous. Yet others were capable of seeing new possibilities in these worrying times. This was particularly true of a young and ambitious military commander quickly coming to the forefront of French political life. Capitalizing on the growing sense of discontent and disillusionment that was setting in, Napoleon Bonaparte intended to turn crisis into opportunity. The star of the Directory may have been waning, but Napoleon's was only just beginning to rise. "I owe everything to the people and the army," Napoleon once claimed, and in this there could be little doubt. A Corsican from a minor noble family, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen through the ranks of the Revolutionary Army to acquire a reputation as an effective and competent commander. He had fought in Italy, claiming it for France and setting up a series of new republican governments that would fundamentally transform the Italian peninsula. Napoleon professed a deep commitment to the ideas of the Enlightenment and republicanism, claiming that, in his military exploits, he sought nothing but the defense of France and the spread of its noble revolution across Europe. And as his military prestige grew, so too did his popularity and association with the revolution. He was hailed as a man who had risen to greatness through his own merit and achievements, attaining glory for the revolution and republic on the battlefield. For many citizens, Napoleon was the embodiment of what the revolution symbolized, an accomplished individual who had not come from a privileged background, a true child of the revolution, as the general liked to think of himself. Napoleon was aware of the unpopularity of the Directory. He was also aware of the desire for stability following the Terror, and recognized that the shaky Directory was incapable of fulfilling this need. However, he was also aware of what the revolution meant to the country. It had become a source of pride for the nation. It had brought France glory and made it the focus of the world. Politicians and political thinkers continued to support its values of liberty and equality, even if they condemned the Jacobins. In essence, Napoleon understood that the revolution could not be suppressed or stamped out. Its appeal, and its mythology even, were too powerful. He himself had fought in the Revolutionary Army and made his name by it. Nonetheless, the revolution had to be tamed. In contrast to the Republican government, Napoleon presented himself as a man of order, a strong individual who could restore confidence in government and rein in unruly forces. As he would remark, "The revolution ends with me." But he also added, "The revolution ends with me because I am the revolution." Conscious of the Bonapartist movement that was growing up in the country by the late 1790s, certain Republican officials began conspiring with the general, believing that this child of the revolution could provide an alternative to the weak Directory. His popularity with the people was unmatched, and the need for a stronger government to tackle the problems faced by the country was clearly evident. Therefore, in 1799, Napoleon and his followers orchestrated a coup against the Republic, overthrowing the regime and installing himself as the head of state. To deal with the problems besetting French society, Napoleon first created a large and extensive bureaucracy that any absolutist monarch would have been envious of. State-appointed prefects were selected to govern each department of the country. These officials, responsible to the Ministry of the Interior in Paris, were charged with collecting taxes, enforcing the law, devising new economic policies, and carrying out all government policies flowing directly from the capital. These reforms drew support from Jacobins as well as absolutists, who believed that a strong state was preferable to the faltering republic of the Directory. Under the Napoleonic regime, tax collection became more efficient and public revenues rose. The economic downturn that had accompanied the revolution began to be reversed as the mechanisms of state administration were vastly improved and perfected. Officials were ordered to make extensive reports of each region of the country regarding resources, land use, and the population. From this information, detailed annual budgets were produced, adding a regularity to state finances that had been severely lacking since the outbreak of the revolution. Under Napoleon, the state became a rational and well-organized machine that was capable of penetrating down to the most basic levels of society. In showing his dedication to the revolutionary ideal of equality, Napoleon enforced a rigid legal equality, insisting that social status and privilege meant nothing before the law. Equality before the law became the guiding maxim for the new Code Napoleon, issued in 1804. Formal legal procedures and the rights of every citizen were clearly spelled out under this new law code, dictating that the state would abide by certain rules that could not be violated. In this way, Napoleon sought to appease liberal constitutionalists, who believed that the powers of government had to be outlined and guaranteed by a contract. If Napoleon supported the revolution, he equally supported order and stability, and these two goals, fulfilling the aspirations of the revolution on one hand, yet resisting the anarchy of Jacobin-style republicanism on the other, became the guiding principles of a Napoleonic government dedicated to implementing an orderly revolution, one that was neither reactionary nor radical. And yet, if Napoleon's policies revealed his dedication to the ideas of the Enlightenment and the values of the revolution, in 1804, Napoleon did something that seemed at odds with his revolutionary character. That year, he declared himself head of a new French empire, officially marking an end to the Republic and, as he claimed, the revolution itself. The Napoleonic Empire was presented as a compromise between order and revolution, between security and the radicalism that the revolution had unleashed. If the empire upheld the ideals of 1789, it resisted the excesses of Republican radicalism. While many Republican critics saw the empire as a contradiction, or worse still, a betrayal to the liberal values of the revolution, there was one thing that made this imperial government sustainable. The strong man at the center, Napoleon himself. Even if the revolution had ended in France, as Napoleon claimed, the new emperor was able to keep its spirit and purpose alive. And he did this by channeling the fervor and idealism of the revolution outward. Continuing the wars in Europe, Napoleon committed his empire to spreading the values of the revolution across the continent. Between 1799 and 1812, French armies would march into Italy, across Germany, and into Poland. Everywhere the French went, new nations and kingdoms would be created. In each of these new states, absolutist monarchs were deposed and feudal institutions abolished. New constitutions were granted, recognizing these states as sovereign entities. Legal systems modeled on the Napoleonic Code were put into place, guaranteeing legal equality. People were encouraged to think of themselves as citizens and, in some cases, national brothers, not subjects of an absolutist monarch. The flip side of this was that Napoleon empowered princes and rulers faithful to him. These new constitutional nations and kingdoms were intended to be satellite states beholden to the French Empire, guaranteeing French influence across continental Europe. However, Napoleon depicted his armies as liberators, not imperialists. French forces were helping oppressed national groups fight for their independence against absolutist monarchies. They were assisting in the creation of new nations and kingdoms based upon the will of the people, or at least so they claimed. Frenchmen committed to the revolutionary program could now seek to fulfill it abroad in Europe. In quieting the revolutionary furies at home, Napoleon had redirected them outward. Generals and military officials could express their patriotism by fighting in Germany or Italy. They could engage in revolutions in Poland or the Balkans, playing out the struggles for freedom and national independence on the European periphery rather than inside France. In harnessing the emotional and ideological power of the French Revolution, Napoleon created a revolutionary empire that intended to transform Europe, recasting the continent through the values and ideals first announced in 1789. Kings and monarchs threatened by a revolutionary France intended to bolster support for a return to solid royalist principles. And it was one chief European leader who, in particular, would prove instrumental in this respect. In 1809, Clemens von Metternich was appointed foreign minister and chancellor to the Habsburg Empire. His appointment came at a challenging time for the ruling Habsburg dynasty in Vienna. Napoleon's armies had swept through Central Europe, shattering the traditional Holy Roman Empire that had historically underpinned Habsburg predominance in the region. With Napoleonic victories across the continent, French expansion threatened to eclipse Habsburg power on the continent permanently, an outcome that Vienna was not willing to tolerate. To this end, Metternich was committed to building an international coalition against Napoleon and pushing back against the French armies. Between 1808 and 1814, he worked closely with Prussia, Russia, and Britain, building an allied coalition. Over the coming years, Allied forces waged a war against Napoleon's Grande Armée in Germany, Italy, and Spain. They took advantage of Napoleon's imperial overreach, which had spread French forces thin across the continent. They bargained and negotiated with local rulers and princes, encouraging resistance to French occupation on the ground. These tactics proved successful. Within the span of 2 years, Napoleonic power in Germany and Italy collapsed, while Allied forces drove French armies out of Central Europe and the Iberian Peninsula. In 1814, Russian forces managed to invade France and occupy Paris, unseating Napoleon and putting an end to his revolutionary empire. Once a superpower that had dominated Europe, the Napoleonic Empire now lay in ruins. The French Revolution was being brought to a conclusion, not through the efforts of a triumphant Napoleon, but at the behest of Allied monarchs who had little appreciation for the values of liberty and equality that the revolution had promoted. In dealing with a defeated Napoleon, the Allies agreed that the general could not be allowed to remain in Europe. Therefore, he was to be sent into exile, with the small island of Elba off the coast of Italy selected as a suitable location. There, Napoleon would be allowed to remain a monarch, albeit one with no influence over European affairs. On Elba, Napoleon filled his days with playing cards, taking walks around his small island kingdom, and trying to keep informed of any news coming from the continent. For a man who had been the unquestionable master of Europe for more than a decade, ending his days as the king of a small, inconsequential island was intolerable, and it was not long before the child of the revolution began to entertain more glorious dreams in line with his personality and sense of grandeur. Believing that he still had a great deal of support in France, Napoleon reasoned that if he were to return, he would be able to raise another army and continue fighting against the Allies, at least leaving him the ruler of France and the head of a great European power. With these goals in mind, Napoleon began plotting his escape, and it was not long before an opportunity presented itself. Leaving Elba in secret, he landed on the coast of France in March of 1815. When news of his escape reached the Allies, they were horrified. They understood it was imperative to stop him before he had time to mount an army and rally supporters, and so they ordered a French brigade to intercept the general before he could make his way to Paris. When the regiment encountered Napoleon and his followers behind them, a tense standoff ensued. It was uncertain whether or not the troops would actually fire on him, and when they didn't, Napoleon dismounted from his horse and presented himself to them unarmed. "Here is your emperor," he stated. "Fire at me if you wish." The soldiers not only refused to fire on him, they raised their weapons to cries of "Long live the Emperor," and then proceeded to join him on his march toward Paris. With this turn of events, the Allies suddenly had to contemplate the possibility of fighting another war against Napoleon. With little time to spare, the Allies branded Napoleon an outlaw and pledged to wage war until he was finally defeated. Over the next 100 days, Napoleon raised an army of some 200,000 men to fight coalition forces. To win the support of liberals and Republicans, he promised to form a constitutional government faithful to the values of the French Revolution. Yet these promises were not enough to secure victory over the Allies. That June, Napoleon suffered a crippling defeat in Belgium at Waterloo, bringing an end to the short-lived promise of a restored empire. With this defeat, the Napoleonic Wars that had disrupted Europe for over a decade were now brought to a conclusion. This time, the Allies were not inclined to be as clement. They had permitted Napoleon to retain a kingdom and live in exile, and he had repaid them with ingratitude. To ensure this never occurred again, the powers settled on the British possession of St. Helena, a small, craggy island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. When Napoleon saw the location, he knew there would never be a chance of escape. This was certainly the end. Spending his remaining days on St. Helena, Napoleon wrote his memoirs, glorifying himself as a liberator and tortured genius who was now being persecuted for his beliefs. This image found a wide reception in France and Europe in the coming years, creating a Napoleonic cult that testified to the former emperor's popular image amongst poets, writers, and the general public. Despite his exile, he remained a popular and almost mythic figure, and it was not infrequent that rumors of his escape from St. Helena were enough to generate momentary states of panic in Europe over the coming years. But these always remained rumors. Napoleon never managed to escape, and would ultimately die there in 1821, a larger-than-life figure who continued to captivate the European imagination even in his absence.